other people into the field. We have a children's book imprint, so we put out these books that feature positive images of children of color. I was asked by American Girl last year to write a book for them, which was super exciting, and I'm one of their lead consultants, so helping with some of the products. I have a super secret product I'm working on with them for 2023. Don't ask me, I won't tell you. And in addition to that, we have a leadership company called Purposeful Hustle, where we go and we speak to organizations and leaders about how to find their purpose and how to work in that space. And on top of all of that, we have this big firm called Uplifting Impact, where we provide services to people who are looking to take diversity, equity, and inclusion and take it from just something they talk about into actual strategy. And so that's a lot of really different things, right? I tell people I could wake up in the morning, go present to like 400 people, come home, and I'm always on some kind of somebody's deadline, right? Trying to write something, and then have to change into my hoodie and my sweatpants, and then I'm in the hospital. Like, girl, you better push. Like, that could be a regular day for me. So, a lot of times people are like, wait, why, Deanna? Why are you doing all these different things? And for me, it really comes back to this idea that I think that we all have power. Denise, I heard you say this, and I saw this in the chat, power, this word of power. I don't think that's a question. It's not like, do we all have, no, we all have power. I think the question is, are we using it?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And how are we using it?
Yeah. And so let's kind of go through some of the things that you would recommend out of the book, and as well as the lessons that you've learned. When you're in this work, we think everybody is in this work. And then I raised my head and I realized there are a lot of people who don't even know where to start.
Mm-hmm.
They want it, but they don't want to make a mistake. They're struggling with how should they show up? Those kinds of things. What do you recommend? How do we get started? How do we go from intent to action?
So I will tell you that sometimes we get these phone calls, right? And we call them our like DEI emergency phone calls. And we're trying to come up with like a good thing that we can put into Slack, like a good image that's like this, like our bat signal, right? Like, oh, something's going on. We gotta manage this. And so, I've done a lot of reflection on what does it mean. In a DEI emergency, what we mean is that somebody's called and they're like, we need your help, right? We were trying to do this and it went the wrong direction. And we were trying to figure out how we kind of manage through this. And whenever I like look at those situations, right, and kind of trace back to, oh goodness, what happened, right? Like, what was the moment that this really turned for this person or for this organization? It almost always comes back to the fact that people often, and not with bad intention, I rarely see any like bad intention or malintention in this, but people will often start with something that is really, really, really big, completely outside of their scope, right? Completely outside of even their knowledge base. And they'll jump into it because they think that that's what they're supposed to do. Instead of taking that moment to really say, where am I at? As an individual, where are we at as an organization? Where are the areas where we actually have some expertise or skill or could show up and use our power effectively? What does that look like for us? As opposed to thinking, wait, I saw them do it. They did it. I should probably do that too. Right? That's where a lot of those problems are rooted in. And so to answer your question, Denise, I think one of the first things and most important things you can do is a self-assessment.
Okay, so let's stop there, because I think we all here and everyone here owns their own business. So we all kind of start with, do a self-assessment. Can you tell us about, when you've gone in or you've coached executives, and I guess maybe really kind of break it down to, so how do I figure out with my company or my space, what can I do?
Yeah, so I would first start with, what are you already doing?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Ask yourself that question. And can I give a little example here?
Yes.
Okay, so working with this amazing organization, global company, such, dedicated people. And one of the things that they reached out to me for is because they were asking this question, what is it that we can do? How do we do a self-assessment? And so I said to them, well, what is it that you're thinking about doing? They're like, oh, well, we're thinking about hosting, a community-wide event where we go in and we talk about some of the most challenging issues of the day. Now, Not a bad, suggestion to do, but let me just give you some background. This was an HVAC company. Right? Their skill set, their expertise was really in engineering and manufacturing and right in this this niche space. And it's not to say that they couldn't rise to that, but I said, well, have you ever hosted a community-wide conversation? No. Do you know, have you ever done something where you've talked about some of the most pressing social issues? No. Do you have anybody on your team who has that? No. So I'm showing you in this story, hopefully, an example of what not to do, right? Like that's not the direction to go. So what we did in that case is we said, but what is it that you do? What are spaces that you're already occupying? And one of the things that became very clear is that they had a huge presence in the space of being able to bring people into the engineering field, right? To bring in people who were really thinking about engineering in a different kind of way. They had been working with a community organization for a really long time. And we said, well, what is it that community organization that is used to and does have the necessary components of being able to engage in that, what is it that they're doing? Oh, well, we hadn't thought about looking. So see, in that situation, some of the things that we had, so if we were bringing this down into what are the brass tacks of what we said?
Right.
We said, what do you do, right? What don't you do? What are the relationships that you have? How much you leverage the places that you're already in? So they were already providing mentoring and financial resources and volunteering in this org. How might you do that, but now do that with the lens towards inclusion?
Yeah.
Right. So then all of a sudden it's like, now they have a much deeper relationship with that partner organization. They don't have to try and figure out, right, like how we're going to do this, but they can participate in the conversation. They were able to open that up to their employees, which they had never done before. And so now all of a sudden they're sitting in the space, right? And then the other thing that they did is they have some cachet, right, with other people, with their vendors. They have cachet with the associations that they belong to. So the question is, how are you going to use your voice in those spaces to raise up this conversation? So now they're in a space where not only can they do well, but they can do it in a place that they already have some power.
Right.
Yeah.
And that tells us exactly where to look for our power. Because I think, you started with, voices to power. And sometimes we think of it as, do I have a big megaphone? And I love the example you just gave, which basically says your megaphone is as large as your network. And you don't have to, we're not about changing the world, but we're breaking it down to one step at a time. Where can we start with what we already have and how do we move forward? Is that about right?
Yeah, and I say this on the individual level too. What is it that you do in your everyday practices? And then try and think about those same practices, but through an inclusionary lens. I'm the person who gets to call the meetings, right? I'm the boss. I get to call the meetings. Okay, well, if I'm thinking about my meetings, what are some things that I could do in my meeting space? That's a place where I have authority that would make it much more inclusive. Yeah. That's a really simple question, but it's a very powerful question.
Yeah. Especially staff meetings or retreats, things like that. How can you just bring a small voice in? How can you just put a lens on, for lack of a better way of saying it, in the whole atmosphere of what's going on? So many people get stalled on this actions to behavior to change because they're concerned about the confrontation part of it. How do you coach somebody who might be a little hesitant? And I don't mean it's from I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings, but we don't want to overemphasize. So if you're white, talking to somebody Black, if you're talking to somebody Hispanic or someone who has invisible or visible, apparent, unapparent disabilities, there are a lot of questions that might be a little unsensitive because you're just ignorant. And so that holds us back from taking the actions. What would you recommend or suggest to us on that?
So I think it's really important that when we're thinking about these conversations, that we actually start with some of the things that we maybe learned when we were in kindergarten, right? Learned when we were trying to build any kind of relationship, which is to make sure that when we're going to conversations, we're actually starting with a genuine and authentic interest in learning from the other person and being able to engage in real conversation. I cannot tell you how many times I've had some version of this conversation with somebody from a marginalized community. So, Deanna, this person who I've been working with for the last 10 years, sitting in the same floor, who I've never had a conversation with, came up to me and asked me about the most polarizing, controversial question they probably could have asked me. But I don't know their name, certain that they don't know mine, right? And what am I supposed to do in that situation? So I don't know why I'm starting with these things of like not to do, but that is a thing. Don't do that, friends, right? Like that is not a good look. That is not a way that you build relationships. And so one of the things I try and encourage people to do is to really start with like, what are some of the basic things that we do to build those relationships up so that when you do have a question, it's almost like you have a bank of goodwill. I genuinely want to know who you are. Like, what did you do this weekend? Right? And while that might seem really silly, if somebody had multiple conversations with me and I know that they care, and then they say something or they're like, hey, so I'm trying to learn this. I'm not really sure how to ask this question. Is it okay for me to ask it? One, I'm more willing to be like, yeah, come on. Like, it's okay. We know we have some rapport. And two, if it goes sideways, to be like, hey, I know your intentions probably aren't this, but let me just tell you how I heard that, what it sounded like to me, because you built up enough goodwill with me. Now let's extrapolate that, right? And there's lots of research that shows you that this actually happens at the organizational level too. When organizations make a misstep, you see this happen and play out. Some organizations make a misstep, and what do we do as the community? Ah, man, I can't believe they did that, right? And others make a mistake, and we think, that's awful. But we know, right? That's not what they intended. And what makes the difference? You know what makes the difference? The research actually has gone back and looked at this, like looked at all of these high-profile cases. I can't remember the name of the researcher right now, but it's one of the ones that we call it in the book. And the research shows that the organizations that were there, not just when it came up in the news, not just went right, but were there consistently and talking and having, those organizations were able to weather any missteps that they might have, right? Or mistakes that they might, but not the ones who were just coming out the gate, right? And didn't have some of that historical presence in the community and in their branding and their marketing.
Yeah, and it's probably, those same companies probably came out too far, like you were talking about earlier, and they wanted for the brand kind of step out of their wheelhouse or out of what their identity is or their brand is, and then came out, and then it's like, this is incongruent with who I know you to be. So it feels, and it doesn't feel genuine in the process. So talked about big companies, you've talked a little bit about each other. This is a community where we want to ask some questions. So I want to pause just a hot second and ask Luz, who's our chat moderator here. Do we have any questions from the floor?
We actually have 2 comments, and I think it's actually a good way for you to connect with the audience members right now. From Michelle Beaucamp, I'm looking at this from the angle of how I can use my voice and also how to get executives to accept and the need to embrace DEI and are hesitant and worried about possible pushback. Do you have a comment about that?
I do. So in the book, can I show it to you? Because it actually came in the mail and I'm so excited. It feels real.
Move your fingers so you can see it.
Thank you. I was so silly when I first got it. I think I just like looked at it and I was like, wait, do I take it with me to my room? Can I just walk around? Like, it's got real words in it and everything. This has been a journey. But in the book, one of the things that we talk about at the very beginning is how do you build the case, right? How do you build the case? And we talk about this from a business case perspective and also talking about it from a moral perspective, right? How do we bring both of these into the conversation? But one of the things that I really try to stress with people is that too often when we're having conversations and we're trying to engage people, especially in these conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, we start from the premise our own premise, right? We start from the things that motivate us, as opposed to really thinking about what are the things that might motivate our leaders. And so I really appreciate your question, Michelle, because you've already stepped over that, right? Like you were saying, how do I look at it from the perspective of the people that I'm trying to bring into the fold? So that's the first step. So I just wanted to acknowledge you for that, because that is huge. And if you do it that way, you're much more inclined to get some buy-in. I think the second thing is to really think about, how do I frame this in a way that actually presents the research and evidence that they're going to need to be able to make a decision? So I will give you another example here, right? Organization, international organization. They were like, oh, Deanna, all these recommendations that you have and everything, I don't know. I'm not sure that we can actually do this. And the thing that I was trying to encourage them to do, they're a global organization, but they don't act globally, right? Everything that they do is very, very US centric. And so the recommendations all were around, here are some things that you can think about that would make you live up to this, right? The fact that you're a global organization, like stop having your meetings in the middle of the day in America. That's not good for the people who are, right? Stop doing everything in just one language, or not offering translations for the things that you know are your key documents. Just stuff like that, right? It's like, yeah, that all sounds good. I wish we could do it. It costs too much. And I said, oh, okay, that's really interesting. Well, I anticipated that we might, go down this pathway. And so I just asked your human resources department and also your sales department to help me understand what was happening from a retention standpoint for the United States versus what was happening globally. Now, if we put a dollar amount, right, and what happens, right? United States retention, global retention. Now, if we put a dollar amount to this retention issue that we have, and this discrepancy and disparity that we see there, how much would that cost? We didn't have to get a number. And I said, now, what were we talking about with like a translator? That's like what, $30 an hour?
Yeah.
Okay. So so whatever it is, right? And so I'm using that as an example to just say that once you know what it is that you need, right, what the resources or the evidence that's going to be most compelling, it's often not that hard to get it. Mm-hmm. Right? It took us 25 minutes to get that retention number, not even. And that was just 2 emails, me, HR, boom, here it is. We know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So Michelle, I hope that helps, kind of think about the framing of what you're trying to get to.
Yeah. I think sometimes that we overcomplicate because we want to have the perfect answer instead of a conversation that leads to an answer. So Luz, you said there were 2. What was the other comment?
Yes. So
I see Michelle just unmuted. I don't know if we could hear from Michelle, because I want to make sure. And then I see there's a second part to your question that I didn't answer. So
I was just going to say thank you. And that's such a good point, because this particular company, they're scientists and they're very data driven. So I know that they need to know the dollars and cents of why they should be involved in DEI. Yeah. So that's helpful. So thank you.
And then I just want to address really quickly, before we go to the second part, Michelle, the other part of your question, which is like, if people are afraid of pushback. Yeah. So one of the things that I try to help people understand, and this is actually, there's lovely data in this book. So if you're like, I don't know where I would go to get to that data, or I can't come, that's okay. You just go in here. We already did the research for you. So you can pull out that data and the resources that you need to really help support in these big key areas, right? In hiring, retention, recruitment, all of that. But what I will say, though, is that one of the things that we get is like, well, it's just better for us to just be quiet because we don't want to, push the wrong button, go into the wrong direction. And one of the things I always try to share there is that, you know what, there's actually a cost to inaction. Mm-hmm. And so really helping people understand, what is the cost to inaction? Well, when you have inaction, people who are looking for, what is your presence? What are you doing in this space? Are not going to apply to your organization. Guess what? This great resignation, who's being impacted by it the most? It's the people who haven't engaged their employees, right? There is a real cost to inaction. And I think that is one of the things that sometimes doesn't get brought up. And it's one of the ones that can really burst that bubble. I had a lovely conversation with a very active organization. It was on our podcast, so I can share the company, but it was Ben & Jerry's. And Ben & Jerry's leader, right? One of their C-suite leaders was on this podcast with us, and we were having a conversation, and he said, you know what? We take stances. Like, we are a company that was built on really demonstrating what our values were, right? And that's something that motivates us, and it's something that we're not afraid of. And he said, you know what? The fact of the matter is, when you look at, and he's like, and it's a business decision too, because the fact of the matter is, when we look at how much it takes us to recruit and, get somebody who's like a loyal customer, and then somebody who might walk away, our loyal customers they stay with us because they know that this is our values. And so that's a higher value, not just higher value because of who they are as an amazing company, but also a higher value in dollars, right? Of how much they are willing to invest in the organ, how like committed they are, how to the brand and all of that. And so again, for them, it's like, no, if we didn't do this, it would hurt our bottom line. Like, we understand that, and we've been able to pull that all the way through. And so not everybody has that Ben and Jerry data, but everybody knows that that is the reality, right? That's why we have so much money that's being invested in brand marketing.
Yeah. Yeah. Luce?
Great.
Last question before we go into break.
Yeah, let's go to Jennifer Golinsky. So it was also a comment. Ideally, it would be nice to build relationships so that when you have an ask, they say, how can I help you? Rather than, what do you want from me? I like the shift in language there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Would you like to comment on that? Because we also have another comment.
Yeah, well, I think that you're so right. And it's even goes back to like this individual conversation. Instead of being like, one of the big things is, what do we say if we're like, I know that something happened and I want to be able to acknowledge it, but I don't want to walk into it. I mean, just look at what happened this last weekend, right? Well, how do I support people in this moment without making it worse? And one of the easiest things that you can say is, I'm thinking about you. I'm here if you ever want to chat. Right? And that's what we do. And that's being a good human, right? Like, that's building true relationship. But that's a nice way to be like, hey, I know there's a lot going on. It's really like hurting my heart. If you ever want to chat about it or talk about it, I'm here. That's an invitation. It is not a, you must talk about it. It is not, let's talk about it right now. It's not a, I don't even know you. And right. It's none of those things. It's, I'm here. I just want you to know, I want to acknowledge it. I'm here. How can I help? So I think it can be used both with like trying to get decision makers, but also just in building up some of that rapport.
Yeah, I think so. And I'm glad that you acknowledged what happened in Buffalo last weekend, because I think there are a lot of companies, a lot of executives, individuals in general, who are, I've heard the term diversity weary. We've done this so many times. Now I'm tired of that, that kind of thing. And I just, it's Thursday, and a lot of them may be paralyzed, which is what we started with at the beginning here in terms of the conversation. Is it too late to make that invitation that you just sent out?
No, I don't think it is. But I do think that I am not a brand marketing specialist, right? But I do spend a lot of time working with organizations around communication, especially communication as it relates to what their inclusion initiatives are going to be. And I think that you have to be in a place where whatever you do, you're authentic about it. Mm-hmm. And so if it comes off, and if it is, oh man, it's Thursday and we have done, if it's like, we have to do it because we feel like we have to, then it's people can tease that out, right? Very quickly. So, but if it is like, hey, this has been a really intense week. We have all been trying to figure out what in this moment, how to best, how we could show up in this moment. We're still not really sure, but we just want to at least acknowledge the fact that, that this is hard and that we're here. That's a very different message than like, wait, it's Thursday. We still have some, we better. That's different, right? I hope that makes sense. But I just feel like it's one of those things that there's a lot happening. And I think there's the other thing that's like, and I really appreciate, Rachel, your comment about our proximity to some of these things. It feels like one thing gets highlighted, another, right? There's a lot happening even just in our individual communities every single day. And I think that's part of the conversation that doesn't even get brought up, right? And so how do we even between, and you always want to think there's never going to be another situation, but how are we showing up on the days where there isn't a news story, right? Or there isn't, that's, I think, even more important than just what we're doing after these big situations.
Yeah.
More important. So, we want to take that back. Not more important. It's just as important.
Yeah. Yeah. Not a hierarchy. It shouldn't be a hierarchy because it's happening everywhere, whether it gets press, in attention of the media or not, it's happening all the time. And that's what makes this whole thing so weary. It just feels like it's all the time.
So I'm going to be in Washington, D.C., actually June 25th. So for those of you who might be in the area or interested, I was asked to speak at the Unity March. I think they're expecting about 25,000 people, and it is a conglomerate of a bunch of different organizations that support Asian Americans, and really to kind of address the hate crimes that have existed, and also just what, as a community, we can do amongst ourselves. So as a Sikh American, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund asked me to be their speaker to represent, their organization and really the Sikh community. And one of the things, we were just on this call yesterday, so it's like very pressing in my mind, but we were on the call yesterday, and one of the things I was trying to say to the organizers is that I'm glad we're going to have a moment, right, where we can bring attention to like how this is impacting all of our communities. But one of the things I'm really, really happy about is that you didn't just look at the Asian American community in this Unity March like situation. You're looking at all of these, because at the end of the day, there's so many of our communities, right, that are in marginalized spaces that are being harmed. And if we could figure out a way to collectively move together, right, because we're experiencing the same, very similar, not the same, but very similar harms. If we could collectively move together, there would be even more power, right? We keep coming back to this word power. There'd be even more power. And so I invite any of you who are going to be in the area to come join us. I have 3 minutes to get that message across, but I'm going to try real hard.
Okay. So if you've been on before, you know that we break into smaller groups. We're only going to give you about 5 minutes to it because we really want to open up the floor to have another dialogue afterwards. So there's a couple of things I want you to remember. First of all, the question in the group is this: what can you do to help yourself or others get over the fear of taking action? Because the point of the day is actions speak louder out of this. While you're in the group, I'm going to ask Deanna to put the full title and link to buy her book, as well as if we can look up where the march is, then we can put that in the chat. And then that way you'll have that. For those people who are listening to this as a recording, unfortunately, this is where we end the recording. And we would love to have you come and join us next month so that you can be part of the conversation. But we are happy that you're listening to this recording. So with that.